everyone, Flora here, and today I'm going to give you an update on our kelp restoration project. This is an update that I've been meaning to film for a while. We've been getting more and more inquiries from you guys asking about this project to know what's been going on. And yeah, today I'm just going to give you a full blown update on what's been happening, and let's get right into it. For those of you that don't know, this is a project that has focused on supporting SeaForester in trialing different kelp restoration methods along the Portuguese coast to hopefully find the most efficient technique that can be applied on a large scale in this country and potentially elsewhere. And why have we been focusing on kelp? Kelp essentially serve as ecosystem engineers. They provide habitat for a vast range of marine species. It serves as food and shelter and also important nurseries for fish species. And besides these ecological roles, they actually also provide benefits to humans. Kelp doesn't just improve water quality, it also attracts tourism, and actually they serve as very important carbon sinks, benefiting all of us. It's precisely because of these reasons that we've decided to support this project in restoring kelp forests along the Portuguese coast. In this vlog, I'm basically going to give you an overview of the whole project and what's happened throughout the years so that you get a full picture of how things have evolved over time. The first trial that we conducted on this project was done in 2021, and it focused on something called the spore bag technique. This trial consisted in collecting the sori, which are the reproductive patches on the kelp blades which produce and release millions of microscopic spores. This was done with one species, Saccharisa polyscetes, which is a species historically present in the project area and that has an annual life cycle. So basically it grows during the spring, and at the end of summer it releases all these spores and it detaches from the rock and dies. The sori of this species were collected, and then they were placed inside spore bags, which were later attached to the rocks on the reef. And the idea was that the spores would then be released and hopefully attached to the surrounding bedrock. Unfortunately, the monitoring after this intervention showed that no kelp established in the surrounding area. This is an important lesson to share with others because it most likely means that this technique is not effective, at least for this species and for this area. And we made these results public at the time, but we are still working on writing a scientific paper so we can reach more people. After this, we shifted our focus onto something called the green gravel technique, which is a technique that basically consists in seeding kelp in a lab onto very small pebbles, then letting that kelp grow for a while, and then deploying those pebbles into the ocean. And since this is a technique where you don't need divers and you can deploy the pebbles from a boat, it could potentially be a lot more scalable and cost effective than other techniques. At the time, this technique had also been tested in the fjords of Norway and was displaying very promising results. This was done by the Institute of Marine Research, and after they published their first paper, this technique was also trialed in other areas of the world and it was being quite successful. However, the Atlantic Ocean along the Portuguese coast is a bit more rough and there's a lot of movement of water. It's a very dynamic environment, which makes it a lot harder for the kelp to overgrow the pebbles and attach to the underlying reef. This basically means that we had to test and trial out different ways to approach this technique for the environment that we were working in. We started off by supporting SeaForester in creating the infrastructure necessary, which means we basically built a kelp nursery. And once we had the infrastructure in place, we started to seed Laminaria ocholeuca on these little pebbles in the lab. And this is an annual species, which basically means that they can live for a few years and is a bit more predictable to work with. After this, we started deploying these seeded pebbles in the Cascais and Peniche areas, and we were deploying them in sites of around 35 by 35 meters. And the intention was to deploy 280 trays of seeded pebbles by September 2023 and then monitor those results. By the summer of 2023, we had already seen some great initial results. The kelp that was deployed survived the winter, and some of it even managed to grow to around 30 centimeters in size, which was very, very promising. And of course, there were still a lot of unanswered questions. If all the conditions were met for an actual kelp forest to establish, sea temperatures have been rising in recent years, herbivory could be too strong to allow for an actual kelp forest to establish. However, the results were good enough to suggest that scaling up the trial would be a good idea, because basically this was also based on the idea that habitat-forming species like kelp, they might need to be deployed in high enough density that they become self-sustaining. In more nerdy terms, we might need to deploy the kelp at large enough scale to overcome these strong bottlenecks. So this was the plan for 2024. Scale up this trial and try to create a self-sustaining kelp forest. For these new deployments, besides continuing with the green gravel technique, we also looked into trialing some new techniques during this year. The first technique is what we call the sea socks technique, and it basically consists of putting small pebbles inside a biodegradable mesh bag and then seeding the kelp directly in these bags. And the theory is that the added weight of the pebbles inside of the sock, they will keep the kelp weight down and hopefully create a bit more stability for it to grow and attach to the underlying reef. These sea socks, they were deployed at a test site in Peniche to see how they do in the harsh Atlantic conditions during the winter. The second thing that we wanted to test was deploying the kelp at a deeper site. So basically, for the first time, we trialed deploying the kelp at 40 plus meters. At this depth, we believe that wave action is reduced in comparison to the shallower sites where we've deployed kelp. And this, in theory, will allow the kelp more easily to attach to the underlying bedrock. Using an ROV, the SeaForester team inspected different areas to find a more favorable site, and they found a good area south of the Berlingas Island, a site they called Cerro do Sudoeste, and this area seemed to have favorable seabed conditions. And the most exciting part was actually that they found scattered kelp in the area, showing that kelp can grow here. Besides these two new trials, we continued to deploy kelp in the Geo Reef, which is where we had the promising results of kelp survival and growth in 2023. And we shifted the deployments a little bit south of the previous site because this area seemed to provide better seafloor conditions for kelp to attach. These three deployments, they took place between September and November of 2024, and we've been really eager to share these results with you. The first deployment happened mid-September, and it was the deployment of regular green gravel at the Geo Reef. 33,600 seeded pebbles were deployed at the site, and sadly, the monitoring showed no survival of kelp in this area. This outcome is, of course, very disappointing, especially after seeing such promising results in the previous deployments at the site. This also provides very important insights for us to refine the deployment times, the criteria for site selection that we will use in future trials. We currently don't know why the kelp didn't survive. It is possible that natural pressures were simply too high, such as herbivory, or maybe some other conditions were not right for the kelp to establish. The Atlantic Ocean along the Portuguese coast is a bit rough, especially during winter, and maybe this makes it harder for the kelp to attach to the underlying reef once the pebbles are deployed. The second deployment took place in early November 2024 at Cerro do Sudoeste. This is an extensive reef plateau that is about 50-60 meters deep, and it historically supported dense Laminaria oholeuca kelp forests and supported high biodiversity and fisheries. This area is severely depleted due to intensive net and trawling fisheries. This was the first time trialing such a deep site, and 19,740 seeded pebbles were deployed at this area, and they were monitored in October 2025, almost a year after the deployment happened. When SeaForester went out there to survey this site, there was an unfortunate accident and the ROV cable snapped and the robot was lost. And this meant that the team had to go back with deep divers to recover the ROV, but also survey the site. What they found when they were out there were 10 juvenile kelp individuals within the deployment area. And unfortunately, it is impossible for us to say if these kelp individuals are from the pebbles that were seeded or if this is simply natural recruitment in the area. Drop cam surveys also identified areas with relatively dense kelp coverage, approximately 1.5 to 2 individuals per square meter, which is actually quite encouraging. Despite the inconclusive results of this first deployment at the deep site of Cerro do Sudoeste, this area still seems like a very promising habitat for kelp forests and for future deployments. This site features an extensive flat and boulder rocky reef, which is ideal for kelp to attach to, and it also seems to have less abundance in grazers, which is good for kelp to establish. The existing dense patches of kelp in the area prove that this is a site that has potential for restoration. All in all, this looks like it could be a good area to focus on for the next deployments. Last deployment in 2024 was of the sea socks and also happened in November in the Peniche area. This trial was basically to test an alternative technique, and we started off with 12 experimental sea socks. The site was then monitored in May 2025, about 6 months after the sea socks had been deployed. The overall results for this trial were quite positive. We had a retention rate of 83%, which means that 10 of the 12 deployed sea socks were recovered. And in terms of spatial stability, this also worked quite well because all the recovered socks were found within 1 or 2 meters of the original deployment location that was marked with a reference buoy. However, there was advanced degradation of the net material that was used, suggesting also that the 2 socks that were not recovered may have opened rather than drifted away. Besides this, there was no significant kelp growth observed on the socks, and this is most likely due to the netting material that was used. The mesh used during this trial is made up of thin strands that move during the deployment and probably also while they're out at sea, cutting into the growing sporophytes. And SeaForester have said that they will repeat this trial in 2026. However, they will be using a different mesh material made out of coconut fiber and cotton. While biological colonization was not achieved in this trial, the results successfully validated this method's spatial stability. The high retention rate and minimal movement demonstrate that the sea socks are capable of staying within the target areas throughout the harsh winter conditions, and this proves to be a very valuable insight for future deployments. Wow, that was a big update, and I hope I've managed to guide you through this all in a clear and structured way. Our partnership with SeaForester started back in 2021, and despite of all the challenges, it's been amazing how much learning has happened on this journey. SeaForester has also continued to grow as an organization, expanding their team and attracting new funding from other institutions and groups, which has been really cool to witness. At the same time, here at Mossy Earth, we have been shifting our focus to building our own local teams and setting up the rewilding hubs in different parts of the world. And this has, of course, taken up a lot of our time and investment to set up. Based on this, we decided that we would not be focusing on any kelp restoration projects for the time being, But we do, however, leave this project in the good hands of SeaForester, and we can't wait to see where the team takes this project in the coming years. If you want to stay up to date with this project and follow the kelp restoration work that SeaForester will continue to do, you can follow their social media, and you can also check out their website. Thanks for listening to me. I know this was a long update, but I hope it was helpful, and see you next time. Cheers!